and good afternoon, everyone. Depending on which part of the globe you're joining us from today, a warm welcome to this webinar on Africa after COVID-19, resetting priorities to transform and build stronger and more resilient economies, brought to you by the African Center for Economic Transformation, as well as the Japan International Cooperation Agency. My name is Dimpho Lecheo. I'm joining in all the way from Johannesburg in South Africa. I am incredibly excited and looking forward to moderating this incredibly important discussion. Now, the purpose of today's conversation is to set the scene for some of the topics to be discussed later in the year at the Tokyo International Conference on African Development, as well as share some initial findings from policy-related research from ACET, JICA, as well as the Ogata Sodako Research Institutes that's aimed at resetting policy priorities for Africa post-COVID-19. The flow of today's conversation is quite straightforward. We'll be hearing some opening remarks from ACET as well as JICA. We'll then see a presentation on that policy-related research that's really forming the basis of today's conversation. And then we'll get straight into our panel discussion with our incredible speakers, as well as our Q&A. Before we get started, I'd just like to remind you to please remain muted unless you have been asked otherwise, but also that you can click on the globe icon that I believe we can all see for interpretation in French and I believe Portuguese, or you can select some of the language options there. I'd also like to use this time to invite you to please add your voice to this conversation by sending us your questions, your remarks, as well as comments by making use of the chat function or engaging with us on social media. Our handle is @ACET for Africa. For now, though, we're going to get started, and I'd like to call onto the stage Mr. Kingsley Y. Amwako, who is the president of ACET. He'll be followed by Ms. Junko Masuda, who's the director for General in Africa, the Africa Department at JICA. The floor is yours, Mr. Amwako.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us for today's webinar. Welcome to our esteemed panelists, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I want to especially thank the Japan International Cooperation Agency, our partner and co-host, who commissioned the policy research that we will be discussing today. Today's conversation is not one-off. It is just a start to a bigger conversation on resilience. The ideas and issues that we talk about today will feed into the upcoming Tokyo International Conference on African Development in August, and will form a basis for a new policy agenda for resilience, progress, and development in African countries going forward. Let me set the scene briefly. We all know that COVID has been an incredible shock to the world. No country has escaped its health, economic, and social impacts. This was not the first shock that African countries, or indeed the world, has faced. Over 2 decades, we have seen a global financial crisis, commodity booms and bust cycles, disease outbreaks, trade wars, severe climate events, and conflicts that have slowed, stopped, and even reversed progress in many places. Some countries have been able to withstand these events relatively well and to recover quickly. Most African countries, however, have not. So, the focus of today's discussions and the research underpinning it is squarely on how African countries can become more resilient. And at the root of resilience is transformation. At the African Center for Economic Transformation, We define transformations as growth with depth, DEPTH, a recipe that goes beyond simple economic growth and insists that growth be accompanied by diversification, export competitiveness, higher productivity, technological upgrading, and better human well-being. Evidence from just after the global financial crisis tells us that African economies were with relatively high economic transformation outcomes suffered less growth loss compared to economies with low transformation outcomes, which suffered up to 3 times more when hit by the same shock. What we know is that African economies were growing a bit, but not transforming nearly quickly enough before the COVID-19 crisis. And so it should not be surprising that those countries are having a hard time recovering and building forward better as COVID-19 continues to circulate. It is therefore important to learn key lessons from economic transformation within Africa and outside Africa, and see how this can help our countries act now to prioritize policies that will help them build economic resilience before the next big shock hits. Our conversation today will allow us to share some of the early findings of the research, but also gain your input on what should rise to the top of the policy agenda for African countries in the months and years ahead. For us at ACET, we will use this opportunity to uncover what is needed to translate the recommendations from the study into policies for resilience, which will allow us to take them forward in our discussions with policymakers, advocates, and other partners across the continent and the world. We look forward to a productive conversation towards strengthening Africa's resilience to speed up the continent's economic transformation. Thank you, and let me pass the conversation to Ms. Junko Masuda, Director General of the African Department at JICA.
Okay, can I start? So thank you, Dr. Moako, for your kind remarks. And thank you, moderator. And also I would like to express my sincere thankfulness to the eminent panelists joining here today and ACET colleagues for organizing this event. I am Masuda Junko, Director General of Africa Department of JICA. Today, I am deeply honored and privileged to make a short remark on behalf of JICA at the beginning of this important online event. Ladies and gentlemen, in my short presentation, I would like to explain why JICA started this important research project 2 years ago in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic, and why this project is so important for Africa now facing multiple crises and for the forthcoming TICAD 8 and beyond. As you may know, the last TICAD 7 took place in Yokohama in 2019 with great success. However, just after that, Africa, Japan, and the entire world were paralyzed by the COVID-19 pandemic in early 2020. JICA was not an exception. In JICA, we drew out most of our staff, experts, and volunteers from the ground of African continent due to fear of contracting the disease, and in fact, some of us did get infected. So we moved to a new work style of cooperation to respond to the emerging needs to combat COVID-19 with remote work technologies. Now our staff and experts are mostly back on the ground, and the volunteers are gradually returning to Africa. In the midst of COVID-19 pandemic, JICA started the research project aiming to formulate a vision on how we should support Africa to get back from COVID-19 crisis and go forward in the post-COVID-19 era. In this regard, we set two research themes, economic transformation and human security, as key concepts for Africa's development toward post-COVID-19. And we started joint research project with ACET on the themes of economic transformation. On the theme of human security, we are conducting another research project with Afrobarometer. Now, in addition to the recovery from COVID-19 crisis, Africa is facing new challenges of food security and other commodities price hike emerging from Ukraine crisis. Also, climate change will be highlighted in Ticket 8 hosted by Tunisia and in this November's COP27 in Egypt. To tackle with these multiple crises, we believe resilience will be a key word for Africa's future. And economic transformation, as well as human security, will be the major key concepts for all of us to go forward toward a resilient, inclusive, and prosperous Africa. This is the key message from JICA toward Ticket 8, which will take place at Tunis on August 27 and 28 this year. So I am extremely happy to join this open webinar to discuss the proposed new policy agenda today, just 2 months before Ticket 8. Furthermore, ACET and JICA will jointly organize a side event on Tuesday, August 23, in full online format in this forthcoming side event. We would like to disseminate powerful message from Tunisia to the world jointly with ACET and other intellectual leaders. Finally, I would like to give some information on JICA Ticket 8 side events to the audience. We will organize 24 full online side events from Monday, August 22 to Friday, August 26. For more details, we will open a dedicated website for JICA Ticket 8 side events by the end of this June. From this site, you will be able to get information and register in the side events. So you want to join by online. So I am looking forward to having you on these side events later. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much to the both of you, Mr. Kingsley Amwako from ACET, as well as Ms. Junko Masuda from JICA, for really setting the scene and helping us understand exactly why we're here today and the importance of the conversation about really building back stronger, more resilient economies that are able to bear the shocks of circumstances like COVID-19. And also underscoring, I think, some of the challenges that the continent had been facing pre-pandemic that remain persistent, such as the issue of food insecurity that's been made worse, of course, by the climate crisis. But I think these are all topics that we're going to hear about from the presentation about the research that has brought us all here together today. And for that presentation, I'm going to call onto the stage Dr. Roberto Tibana. He's the Director of Research at ACET and is going to be telling us more about some of those key findings and recommendations.
Thank you, Dimpo. I hope my screen is visible now. Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone, and all protocol is observed. And thanks to the moderator for giving me the opportunity to, the research team, the opportunity to make this presentation on the topic of building resilient economies in Africa through transformation, and to contribute for setting policy priorities for the agenda of economic development in Africa in the future. The aim of this presentation is to support the discussion of this forum by providing some elements, as the moderator said, of the evidence that we have gathered over the last 8-9 months, building on scholarly knowledge and actually standing on the shoulders of some of the intellectual achievements of some of the panelists that are here today. And we also build on our ACET's prior research work, and we also look at new data in the course of this research. So in my presentation, I'll start with a very brief element of the context that motivates this research. I mean, the broader context have been given, but in a narrow sense for this research, before going into a slightly deeper review of the concepts that we use and how we relate them. And then I will move into the issue of country classifications, which is a key element in the research that we did. And this is important for policy analysis because there is no reason why any policy recommendation should be seen as a one-size-fits-all. And the core of the findings that we'll be bringing will be highlighted in the brief discussion of the relationship between resilience and economic transformation, which is the core of the research and the topic of the discussions that will follow in TCAT. I will end with a brief outline of what we see as priority areas of policy for building resilience of African economies going forward. And I'm afraid I will stop at highlighting key areas of policy priorities and leave to the discussions that will follow the critical task of looking forward in what policies and concrete interventions can be adopted to address some of the challenges that we will highlight, particularly on the issue of how to build resilience through transformation. And this slide, which is the brief context that I wanted to give, what we really see is that Africa, I mean, going back a little bit in this discussion, the Africa Rising was a buzzword towards the end of the 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s. And the story of the 6 fastest growing economies of the world being African is well known. Ethiopia, Mozambique, Angola, and we remember the big IMF conference in Maputo on Africa Rising. And this was because the last growth acceleration in Africa was quite an extended one, and it lasted longer than all the previous accelerations since many African countries accessed independence. But not surprisingly, they ended for similar reasons. And this one also ended for similar reasons, which is the fact of the impact of the global business cycles and growth cycles and some idiosyncratic shocks like wars or trade wars or military wars, and even mega trends such as China's slowdown in growth, or even strikes of epidemics and pandemics, which tend to lead all these things to global demand slump and investment slump that then reverberates across the world and reflects in African economies in terms of declining terms of trade, which then have various deleterious impacts in these economies. So basically, the story is not new. And in fact, the Africa Rising hope was dashed by the global financial crisis in 2007. Before I go into those details, I will try to provide some of the analytical elements that we operate with in this research as we reflect over some of the facts highlighted above. And these are the concepts or the notions of economic transformation, economic vulnerability, and economic resilience. Economic transformation, obviously, as the economic and social outcomes of policies that can reduce or exacerbate vulnerabilities of the countries, on which vulnerability we see natural and man-made conditions that expose a country to shocks. On economic resilience, we see the ability of an economy to withstand resist shocks or the impacts of shocks, or when it is negatively affected, to be able to quickly and strongly recover from them. These are very well-known concepts and structural analysis that focuses on how and when resources, labor, capital move from one sector to the other, and the benefits of policies guiding this process so that the resources move from lower to higher productivity sectors has been the bread and butter of development economics analysis for many, many, many decades. But there's some innovations, and in one of the innovation sides of it is the ACET concept of that was mentioned here by Dr. Amwako of depth, with which ACET came up after pulling out existing knowledge from many other corners, intellectuals, and even organizations like UNECA, and came up with this notion that for countries to really develop sustainably in Africa, they should diversify, promote export competitiveness, productivity growth, technological upgrading, human well-being, which came to be dubbed depth. On the vulnerability side, there has been some controversy because some people will tend to take vulnerability of a country as a given. You can't do anything. You are an island, you can't do anything, that you are a small one. You live in a place prone to typhoons, you can't do anything about it. But in the wider sense, vulnerability can also be influenced by policies. And in that sense, it's man-made. So policies can really influence economic vulnerability, economic resilience, and economic transformation in a way that it's very complex, that we cannot always address here. But we operate with these concepts and with these interactions. We also try to, as I said at the beginning, there is no reason why policy should be seen as a one-size-fits-all. So one of the concerns and one of the things that JICA asked us was whether we could come up with some, ways of doing some country groupings that can help in the future to tailor policies to specific groups of countries according to their traits in these all dimensions of transformation, vulnerability, and so on. And so we developed, the core is a statistical clustering that sits on by using the ATI dimensions that have been mentioned here, Africa Transformation Index dimensions, which capture the 5 dimensions of the depth framework. And we also developed some measures of growth resilience that I've talked about there. And we also use indices of vulnerability developed elsewhere, like from the UN system. And we cluster countries in this sort of characteristics and come up with groupings. We look in the research into other groupings of countries that come from institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and OECD, and UN system, and we consider them in the analysis. But the core of the classification that I'm talking about here builds mostly on these 3 dimensions that are up there in the blue square. So we come up with countries that we classify them according to depth dimensions and those other supplementary elements, and we come up with 3 groups of 1, high transformers that perform above average in all depth dimensions, that is, do better in productivity, diversification, technological upgrading, human well-being, export competitiveness. And then we have middle transformers that sit in the middle amongst this, but they really perform worse than other clusters in diversification and export competitiveness. And their technology upgrading is really very far from average, even though paradoxically they tend to do well in human well-being. And then we have low transformers. We have traits similar to the middle transformers, but they really have a much weaker productivity and export competitiveness performance, and very small, very low in human well-being. And on the right side, I put examples of these countries like Tunisia, Eswatini, Morocco, South Africa, Mauritius, Lesotho as being high performers, Egypt, Gabon, Botswana in the middle with Algeria, and then a pack of really struggling countries coming down: Zambia, Ghana, Cameroon, Mozambique, Rwanda, despite the achievements that these countries have had in some other dimensions. But if you take them as a whole, according to all those characteristics that we used to cluster them, they can really have these difficulties. So it's not like you box the countries, but you really picked up the main characteristics and you grouped them in such a way. This is just a matter of giving examples. I'll go on then to talk a bit more about the Africa's experience and findings that we have and how it has performed in terms of transformation between 2000 and 2019. We have developed this, started developing this in the post-COVID, but most of the indicators that we use are basically ending in 2019. The key thing is that there is no need why we should not consider the COVID shock in some respects, similar to some other shocks. So some of the lessons that we get here are quite possible to be applicable to the implications of the COVID, even though there are some characteristics given the nature of the pandemic. But generally, we see that Africa up to 2019, and here it's 18 because we average this over 3 years. So when we get to 18, it means that we average it for 17 to 18. So this is basically what we see. On the red is all the ATI indicator there, showing good performance in the first portion of the period since 2000, but then the countries begin to buckle, to fall up in terms of both growth and transformation, starting in 2007-8 with shock, the global financial shock, and then really going into deeper slide since 2014, which is when we really have the end of the so-called commodity super cycle, which lasted long and might be behind some of the long-lasting growth accelerations that we were talking about there. So the green line is the GDP per capita growth, the blue line is GDP aggregate growth, and the red line is Africa, it's the economic transformation, aggregated for all countries, weighted, individual countries weighted by their share in the GDP. We have used a sample of 33 countries that produce about 90% of total Africa GDP in 2019. We go and look into some detail to their various dimensions of depth that we talk about. For instance, the employment ratio out of the total labor force, the wage of salaried, the waged and salaried female, the percentage of women who are engaged in salaried employment, the GDP per capita and the Gini index. These are dimensions of the so-called human economic well-being dimension in our indicator. And as you can see, it's progress across the board. Inequality is falling, wages increasing and stagnating sometime later, but generally a positive trend in this dimension of human well-being. But when we go into the other direct dimensions of the economic transformation, for instance, if we look at diversification, productivity, technological upgrading, we see really a general downward trend. The yellow one on the lower right corner that you see, that is the human well-being that we were looking at before, and it's the only one that's straightforwardly positive and stagnates towards the end of the sample period. But the other ones are really kind of struggling, export competitiveness, progressing well, but then becoming volatile in the last 5-10 years. Productivity going down over time, technological upgrading, improving in the first 5 years, but then going down the hill, and so on. So if we look at these fundamentals and these sustainable forces for economic development that can be supportive of human economic well-being, we see a risk there that even human well-being in the longer term can be jeopardized by the failure to make good progress in these other economic transformation dimensions. We have looked closely at the labor productivity growth across sectors and over time. to see where is it coming from, what is the contribution that moving labor and other resources, in this particular labor, from low productivity sectors to higher productivity sectors brings to economy-wide productivity, and growth in economy-wide productivity that comes from internal to a sector or an activity productivity growth that comes from increases in capital, technology, in the sector management, and so on. And what we find is that most of the growth, and this is really not very granular, some analysis can go very disaggregated, and we have country studies that undertook a more disaggregated analysis. We operated here with a limited number of sectors, agriculture, manufacturing, services, and lumped the other ones under other, just to summarize the story. But you can go further granular on this and you can find some nuances on this. But generally, we find that within sector productivity, it's what really commands the growth in economy-wide productivity in Africa over the last 20 years, because the structural element, that element of moving resource from low productivity to higher productivity sectors, it's quite weak. And if you look at that, we see that the agriculture sector is one that's really doing much better on the within sector, but it's really doing badly in terms of the elements of the structural transformation, partly because it's actually moving labor from there to other sectors, but also because we see that there are some subsectors in agriculture that tend to absorb labor without really improving technologies and improving. So you can see all that contribution within the agriculture sector if you disaggregate it. Manufacturing, it's really a problem in Africa. It hasn't contributed much. We have countries that are really falling apart in their manufacturing performance, and we know that the whole continent it's not doing well, at least compared with some other regions, even with its own past history. If you look at some individual countries, and we see that services are doing well. I mean, there's quite a lot of contribution of services, both in terms of within sector and it also being productive. And here we have lumped lots of services. There are some services which are quite informal in some senses, but there are some services which are very high productive, like financial services and so on, logistics services and so on. So if you disaggregate this, you can find nuances. But generally, there is this general observation, which brings in controversial conversations sometimes in development, that some people or institutions tend to believe that it's probably possible for Africa today to leapfrog over manufacturing and go into services. We have a different view on that. We think that manufacturing, it's still critical to Africa's economic development for many other factors that have been highlighted by scholars, like the importance that it has for developing other sectors, providing inputs and externalities, and the technological development that it facilitates, and so on. There are so many reasons, and the potential for absorbing labor, despite the apparent weakness relative to services in terms of its contribution to economy-wide productivity growth. We think that African countries still have to focus on manufacturing for many other reasons than just looking at these elements here, but that's where we are. We have looked at that relationship between transformation and resilience, and we did an analysis based on the global financial shock crisis. We took it as a real natural experiment. I mean, it's possible to replicate this kind of analysis into other shocks, like the COVID shock, for instance, for which in further studies that we are undertaking, we're going to be doing this. But one simple fact that comes in is that countries with high transformation outcomes have suffered less growth from the global financial shock than low and middle transformers. You saw those groupings that we did there of high, low, and middle transformers. Low transformers suffer 3 times as much loss in growth when they're impacted with shocks like the global financial crisis than high transformers or middle transformers. And this is really the core of the finding, and it's very important because it highlights the importance of economic transformation in the sense that we have been talking so far in this presentation for really building the resilience of the economies in Africa. we have picked up on a number of other studies. For instance, there was a very recent paper from the IMF that discusses fiscal resilience. And we picked up on those elements and we mixed up with our data on economic transformation. And, you know, on the left, on the vertical axis here, you have revenue concentration. And on the horizontal axis, we have our indicators of economic transformation. And it's clear, even though this is a correlation, we're in the world of correlation here, not of causation. We need to unpack this in terms of causation. But it's clear that countries, that economic transformation is also good for fiscal resilience in the sense that countries that have better outcomes in economic transformation, diversification of the production structures and exports, labor productivity, technological upgrading, and overall economic transformation, they tend to have better, they tend to have less revenue concentration. And it's obvious, they have much diversified tax base, they have more activities on which an economy can lean on if one activity is affected by shocks, and they have relatively higher income. So it's obvious that when countries do have these better transformation outcomes, they will have a greater fiscal resilience, they have more resilient revenue, and that will have implications for debt resilience and fiscal resilience as well. So that's a very important point. And from here, as I said, we are not going to really be very prescriptive on the specific policies, but we really have some ideas that we're beginning to build on in terms of key lessons and policy priorities for building resilience in African economies. One, focus on economic transformation, as we have indicated, structural transformation, economic transformation in the depth sense, industrialization, in particular manufacturing, investment in skills, effective regional economic integration, and conducive institutional environment. We can go on in details of this, but I'm not going to do this right now because I'm conscious of time, and our objective is to really get the panelists and audience to help us with their experience and knowledge to really bring what can African countries do to achieve this. Second, have a coherent industrial policy. Industrial policy in Africa has been stigmatized, and it has been battered for good reasons. It led to building white elephants, big undertakings that were not productive, drained state resources, didn't contribute much to development. And when the reforms came in the mid-80s and 90s, they just went and killed any idea about industrial policy because of this stigma. We think there is a new sense in which we should think, and scholars like Stiglitz and Roderick and many others have really given lots of contributions about new ways of thinking about industrial policy. As all policies, they can help to promote the reallocation of resources from lower to higher productive activities, not in the old sense of building smokestack industries. So it's very important that African countries have a clear vision about what industrial policies means in modern times and really revisit those industrial policies and develop them. Entrenched in long-term visions and plans that transcend changes in political leadership. In our country studies, we have found lots of examples where a change in an administration, even in a country with the same ruling party, you tend to have either reversals, abandonment, you know, of policies initiated by previous administrations. It's very important that a long vision is built that can ensure that country operators and development partners are glued together in a long-term strategy that transcends the cycle, the political cycle to promote development. That involves identifying interests, building coalitions, and developing binding incentives mechanisms that can really help institutions and societies to navigate the political economy hurdles that they need to navigate in order to affect effective development. Develop well-supported, managed and financed industrial policy organizations, banks, foreign direct investment offices, departments of support to small-scale, medium enterprises. They set goals and others training institutions. They set goals, develop and implement strategies, monitor processes, and evaluate outcomes. There must be a deliberate and systematic process to build an ecosystem of IPOs that can take care of all these things and be consistent in implementation, because very often we find that our countries are very good in designing mechanisms, designing processes, designing legislation, defining policies, but we lack a lot of implementation effectiveness. Establish effective coordination mechanisms with private sector to address key market failures. Apex bodies and forum of public-private dialogue and coordination, they should be effective. They shouldn't be just talking shops. I could give you examples, but I'm not going to go into that, where you really, heads of state, prime ministers, meet with the private sector, debate, make decisions, but then when it comes to implementation, many often decisions that have been made are not followed through by either sides. But mostly what we find is that the private sector tend to find the governments doing their own thing rather than what has been agreed on the table of the conversation. So it's very important that these mechanisms are effective and sort of a mutual accountability mechanisms are established. And it's a very tricky issue of what incentives do you have to design to make sure that we don't just say, oh, it's a matter of policy willingness, How do you really build policy willingness there? Fix the political economy of development. That means having a leadership that identifies common interests and build those coalitions that I was talking about. And most importantly, investing in building a competent and less corrupt bureaucracy. Very often in African communities, big enemy to the development of the private sector. And for that matter, to economic transformation and building resilience is a bureaucracy that it's inimical to the private sector in many senses that we all know. And I'm not going to elaborate on this. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Roberto Tibana, for that comprehensive breakdown of what is in that policy driven report that's being put together by ACET in partnership with JICA. He is, of course, the Director of Research at ACET, touching on some really, really important points. I mean, I think underscoring that all-important line, that resilience depends on the economy's ability to transform, touching on some of the critical sectors that are going to drive Africa's development post-COVID-19, including agriculture, technology. And I think also emphasizing on the importance of manufacturing and the manufacturing industry within the continent, as well as investing in skills, and as someone who works within the youth development sector, we're always talking about youth unemployment and how to get young people roped into the employment market. And it always goes back to those demand-driven skills that they're able to present at the marketplace. And I think also touching on, that gap between policy and implementation. Africa is known for developing some of world-class programs and initiatives, but somehow when it comes down to implementation, we always fall short. And I think we're going to find out why, but also just have an in-depth conversation about policy, about Africa post-COVID-19, and of course, how we build stronger and more resilient economies with an astute panel that I'll be introducing now. But before I do that, just another clarion call to everyone who is joining us live to please interact with us throughout this discussion. You're more than welcome to pose questions and make comments by making use of the Q&A or chat function here on Zoom. You can also engage with us on social media. Our social media and digital teams are standing by, and the handle is @ACET for Africa. Right now, though, as we launch into our panel discussion, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panelists. From Tufts University, we are joined by economist Professor Margaret Macmillan. We're also joined by Professor Izumi Ono, and they are representing JICA. We're joined by Dr. Ken Shawa from the International Labour Organization. And last, but certainly not least, from the Dangote Group, we're joined by Director Mansour Ahmed. I beg your Yes, Dr. Mansour Ahmed, who's joining us from the Dangote Group. A very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for making the time to have this discussion with us, and I think bring on your expertise as well as your insights. But I think just a general question to all of our panelists to set the scene for this discussion. You know, Africa was already not developing quick enough before the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the pandemic led to the first contraction in most African economies for over the past 25 years. What was so different about this pandemic for it to bring about such impacts, and how can the continent really prepare to resist and build back better and avoid and build back better from similar incidences in the future? I think we can start with Professor Ono, and then Professor Macmillan, and then we can wrap up with Dr. Kenshawa.
Okay, Dimpo-san, thank you very much for your kind introduction. My name is Izumi Ono, and also I would like to congratulate ACET team for that really hard effort to compile those very important that analysis. Thank you for your question regarding COVID-19 impact. I shall say that because there are so many various shocks, so I think each shocks has a specific channel of transmission of diffusing various I think impact, and COVID in a sense is very special. In a sense, it's a very much comprehensive, and it's not just a health crisis. It's involve both social and economic crisis, and it's in the global scale. It happened that simultaneously. And I think one important maybe feature of COVID crisis is that it has a broad policy-induced maybe demand suppression because of social contact has been depressed. So by lockdown is a very much, I think, important measure, but had a lot of implication. At the same time, supply side has been also disrupted, and production has been disrupted because of those social distances. So those are, I think, major, I think, differences compared to the other like a natural disaster, which is much more local specific, and also financial crisis, which risks has been transmitted through financial channel. So I think COVID is very special. And then other thing which I want to mention is that maybe in the case of COVID, because of these specific natures, maybe sector or industry specifically that the impact has been different. I think service sector was affected a lot because of tourism sector or restaurant, etc. And also maybe manufacturing sector later, depending on the type of that industry. So I think we need to think about by industry, and also depending on the country's industrial structure, the implication of the COVID would be different. Talking about Africa, I think looking at from maybe outside of Africa, I think Africa has managed, I think, quite very well compared to like North America or European countries, the immediate impact of spreading COVID, which I think at the same time, nevertheless, because of the maybe vaccination or availability, access, and maybe other structural factors, I think recovery of that the COVID maybe impact has been very much slow. And now we have an additional crisis like a grain crisis. So I think recovery phase is getting maybe prolonged. And then I really feel that it is very important to address not only that maybe just the COVID, the impact, but also we have to think about the pre-existing maybe factors. Because for example, I have been working for Ethiopia for some time for industrial policy dialogue. Actually, they did had a lot of negative impact by COVID, and industrial park had a lot of problem in maybe the textile apparel companies. At the same time, their major maybe problem is not just the COVID. They had a lot of foreign exchange shortages or maybe basic logistic problem that is a pre-existing factors that really affect a lot for slow recovery of their industrial production. So I really feel like it is very important to look at that maybe structural factors, existing factors to really resolve recover, medium and long-term recovery. So this is the area which I really think that why resilience is really linked to the structure that the problem which ACET research is finding out. So thank you so much.
Prof. Macmillan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I agree with everything Izumi said, especially the tourism sector in East Africa have been very hard hit by COVID. My research focuses more on what Roberto called the low transformers. So the poorer countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and I think two things there have been very important in terms of how COVID impacted these economies. One is a drying up of resources from the international community. I mean, so much money and effort and focus went to, developing vaccines and taking care of people in rich countries. And then these economies, they run to a large extent on, small and medium-sized enterprises are the backbone of a lot of these economies. And when you can't go out, people were, moving to rural areas to avoid being in large groups and being contaminated. That sort of quashed to a certain extent these entrepreneurs. And then you had some poor decisions taken by African leaders in terms of ignoring COVID, or not just African leaders. We had that also in the Western world, but I think that also aggravated the impact of the crisis. But I don't think, I'm optimistic about the ability of these economies to bounce back. You're muted.
Yeah, you have to unmute yourself, Bimbo.
Apologies. I was saying, Dr. Shao, you may feel free to join in on the conversation. You're already unmuted, so you can go ahead.
Oh, great. So thanks so much. I want, first of all, to agree with the previous speakers. They have said it very well. Indeed, this crisis was multi-pronged. It's not necessarily the same as those that we've had before, because this one was an economic crisis, it was a health crisis, and it is one that brought a lot of uncertainty. So what it meant was that intervening into this crisis was an issue, because if you opened up the economies, you encourage the spread of the disease. If you wanted to stifle the economy by business closures, by travel restrictions, you also affected, the issues in terms of, transferability, transmission of the disease. So it was a very difficult, crisis to deal with. And we saw very well that the closures meant a lot in the case of Africa. Africa has a very high informal economy, as we all know. Closing out enterprises simply meant reducing incomes of enterprises. It also meant reducing incomes of workers. It also meant really scrambling the economy. But we saw that although the tourism sector almost collapsed, we saw that although those most vulnerable people in the informal economy suffered the brunt of this, we saw that countries that introduced some policies that ensured the trickle down from the macroeconomy to the social issues did fairly well. So we saw countries that stimulated the economies and employment by, for example, emphasizing on active fiscal policies, accommodative monetary policies, lending, to the SMEs, helped or did better than those that not do that. So we supported countries that ensured that they supported enterprises, countries that ensured that jobs survived, countries that ensured that incomes were not disrupted through social protection, for example, through implementing employment retention services. And of course, tax breaks made a difference. But we also saw that countries that made deliberate issues of protecting their workers, introducing guidelines of OSH, safety and health at the workplace, occupational safety and health at the workplace, managed to contain this better and therefore managed to prepare a better road for resilience. But something that is also important is that during the COVID, we saw also that there was need for businesses to talk to employees, for employers to talk to employees, and we realized that without an important system of social dialogue, that was going to be difficult to manage this. Countries that invested in a system that supported the dialogue helped better, build a resilient, economy. And we think that these policies should go on. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Shawa. For someone who does a lot of dialoguing in their everyday life, I have to agree with you that the opportunity that COVID has given us to have conversations we've never had before, from between employees and employers, but also I think, those in government and those in power, dialoguing and having conversations with their constituencies about a way forward, socially as well as economically, is something that we've seen being done during the COVID period, and that we've never seen before. But I'd like to now come back to Professor Margaret Macmillan. For many years, you have been doing research on structural transformation across the developing world on the African continent. The focus of today's conversation is on economic resilience. What are some of the lessons of good practice regarding economic resilience that we can learn from structural transformation or lack thereof in Africa and other parts of the world?
Thank you for that question. So I first wanted to sort of state some facts that have come, stylized facts that have come out of my own work. And they're slightly different from what we heard from Roberto. And I think it may be because I focus primarily on the low-income transformers. So when I look at sub-Saharan Africa, I exclude Mauritius and South Africa. But in the countries I've looked at, we've seen significant structural changes. So notice I'm saying structural change and not structural transformation. We've seen declining shares of employment in agriculture, increasing shares of employment in services, and also in manufacturing. But we've also seen declining labor productivity growth in both manufacturing and services. And so to try to better understand this, I, together with some colleagues, including Jenny Roderick, took a look more carefully at the manufacturing sectors in Ethiopia and Tanzania. And what we see there is rapid employment growth in small firms, and limited productivity growth in those firms, and much more limited employment growth in larger firms where there is productivity growth. So in terms of, well, let me, so in terms of resilience, I think that this kind of spontaneous growth of these small enterprises in the manufacturing sector is remarkable. And I think that those firms need to be better supported and understood. But what I think that a comparison between Ethiopia and Vietnam here is instructive. So Vietnam sort of built its manufacturing sector on the back of FDI, And it was, when it started its reform policy, there was practically no foreign direct investment in that country. And there was a huge amount of informality. And there still is a lot of informality in the manufacturing sector in Vietnam. But there is also a large group of firms with between 1 to 9 employees that are extremely productive. And so Ethiopia was, its industrial parks prior to the onset of the Civil War were generating a significant amount of employment. So employment growth in those parks was between 30 and 40% per annum from 2015 to 2019. And there were a lot of hopes that these firms could connect with smaller firms and raise the productivity of small firms through these linkages. And I think that's something that's happened in Vietnam, and I think that that's something that's worth studying. But basically, I think the lessons from the work that I've done is that there needs to be, at least when it comes to manufacturing, but I think services as well, there needs to be kind of a two-pronged strategy. So I think we need to take these small and medium-sized enterprises seriously. And by that, I mean, there have been tons of policies in the past in African countries vis-a-vis these small businesses, but they still seem to lag very much in productivity. So can we evaluate what's been done, and can we learn from that in terms of new and more creative ways to support these businesses? And I think the kind of work that you're doing, Dinfo, working with youth and so on, that to me seems extremely important. But then there's also the larger, more formal firms, and I think every country is going to be different, so Ethiopia may be able to attract more investment in the apparel industry, but Kenya and Ghana maybe not, because they don't have large reservoirs of low skill workers, but they have other things that they can do. And I think there needs to be recognition that the different types of manufacturing will employ to a greater or lesser extent workers, will create more or less jobs depending on the capital intensity of the specific manufacturing sector. For example, agro-processing, it is very capital intensive, but there are all kinds of opportunities for creating jobs upstream from those investments. And I wrote a paper recently with Albert Zufak for the chief economist for Africa, at least for the next, at the World Bank, at least for the next 8 days. But I was looking for information about the kinds of linkages between large firms and small firms that I could use as an example of the indirect job creation by the larger firms. And I had to rely on a study from California for that. So there's some of these practical issues that I think need to be paid, more attention. But in terms of resilience, I mean, the African people have shown in the face of plenty of hardships, their entrepreneurship, their ability to get on with things, even in the face of terrible circumstances. So from that perspective, I'm hopeful. And also that is one of the reasons why I believe that we should take these small businesses more seriously.
Take small businesses more seriously. I absolutely agree. And to your point about African people being incredibly resilient, I mean, some of the most entrepreneurial people in the world, regardless of the multiple barriers that they face, particularly in informal sectors. So thank you so much, Professor Macmillan, for that contribution. But staying on research as well as lessons learned, my next question is for you, Professor Ono. And you have done some research on development, industrial policy, as well as international development cooperation on the continent, comparing Africa to Asia. Reflecting on that work and considering the current African as well as global environmental megatrends, what lessons can we learn from other parts of the world on how to transform the economy in Africa, as well as build resilience. And I'm going to be a bit unfair and ask a second question in addition to that. What should industrial policy in Africa look like?
Okay, Dimbo-san, thank you very much for the fundamental and also the very comprehensive questions. Regarding your question about what African industrial policy should look like, I must say there is no industrial policy for Africa in general, because Margaret said, I think there are country-specific situation. So we need to think by country by country. Kenya is different from Ethiopia. Ethiopia is different from Mozambique in resource endowment or labor endowment, etc. So I don't think we should talk about industrial policy for Africa, or there is no industrial policy for Asia either, because Asia is also diverse. Some Asian countries did marvelously, like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam is making an effort, but not all the Asian countries are not good as some of the African countries. So I think we have to be more country-specific situation. At the same time, I think there are also the lessons which we can learn from maybe East Asian experiences. Many people talk about that flying geese pattern of East Asian development model, which is manufacturing export-led model, and whether this is applicable or not. And on that kind of things, I have to say that maybe this is maybe East Asian, maybe regional production network was a basis. So this kind of approach may not be replicable itself in Africa, but we can also draw some implication of what made this East Asian, maybe flying geese model possible in spreading those the production network among East Asian regions. I have to say that maybe approach to the industrial development we can learn to some extent from East Asia, because for particular model is concerned, it depends on the time of international policy environment, and so we cannot really replicate certain that model. But I think when we talk about maybe East Asian maybe success in certain countries, we can find out certain maybe possible factors, including maybe strong commitment of the political leadership in industrial development itself. And I think they are very much interested in looking into the real sector economies and talking to the private sectors and how they can work together, the public-private partnership. I think in Korea in the past that the President Park, although it was authoritarian development regime, but he really had a lot of export push conference with the key industrialists, and then they have some shared agreement of the goal of export. And if they perform very well, they are really got some export that, for example, reward. So I think those kind of maybe strong commitment of the leaders in talking to seriously to the private sectors, finding out the bottlenecks, and then responding quickly. I think those kind of, I think leadership commitment is very important. And also secondly, I shall say the, I think core agencies in charge of industrial sectors and development, like the Ministry of Industries or like investment commissions, like in talking to the private sectors, those I think core institutions in charge of industrial development with broad mandate, that is also I think necessary, and then also maybe changing a mindset of those maybe policy makers as well as maybe private sectors in maybe working very hard for that kind of thing is very much important. So I think Roberto's maybe that point out some of the key element of what makes industrial policy effective, and the institutional aspect he mentioned is, I think I really agree with that. Another aspect is I agree with maybe Margaret. I think there are diversity of development strategy and development paths. So even in East Asia, it's not just maybe manufacturing export-led growth. I think some countries even in Thailand, which is very good in automotive industry, they had also food processing industry, Malaysia as well. Or when we look at different regions like Brazil or Chile, they have maybe natural resource-based industrial development. Chile has a thermal industry development, which was also developed based on private-public that partnership. So I think we have to think about that maybe various opportunities of that industrialization in a broader sense, particularly right now that we have a much more opportunities for that with using digital skill to industrialize agricultural development, or we can also think about the opportunity for the green industrialization. So I think Africa can have a maybe broader option or diverse path to industrialization and by each countries. So how we can start up that kick off those things is very important. For that, I think industrial policy have to have not just improving business environment in general, but also looking at some of the key maybe aspects of that the potential industry have to sort about. And that is also based on public-private partnership. Okay. Regarding to maybe the questions, maybe I hope I have answered most of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ono. Yes, you have answered all of my questions quite comprehensively. So I think touching especially on the need for those private and public sector partnerships to work in order for us to see an industrial policy that is effective. I think we'll have an opportunity to ask you some more questions on that, because as you were answering, I see that there's been a lot of activity in our chat function, people either responding or asking follow-up questions to your contribution. But now to bring you in, Dr. Shawa, and ask you a question that I think is also close to some of the work that I do. And it's on the issue of young people on the continent, right? Currently, nearly 2/3 of the young population in Africa are either unemployed or underemployed. In South Africa alone, about almost 9 million young people are neither in education, employment, or training. What perils does this harbor for the future of our continent? And what should African development strategies look like from an employment perspective?
Thank you so much. Indeed, Africa is a very young, continent. 34% only of the working age population is actually covered by the youth. Africa as a region is very unique in the sense that it is the only one that has this huge labor force, and where the labor force is still growing when you look at the global economies. But I think before I answer the question, let me draw your attention to the idea that when we look at labor markets, we tend to overuse unemployment or employment or underemployment, for that matter, as an important indicator. But there are other important indicators that would make us understand the labor market better. So let me start by saying, therefore, that informality rate for most of African youth is as close to 90%, which means, therefore, that any young person who gets a new job is likely to get an informal job. When we are talking about an informal job, then we are talking about a job that has all these decent working deficits. People who do not earn a dignified income, people who do not have social protection, people who have no rights at work, people who cannot organize. So we're talking about our young people getting into an economy that basically does not support them, because they're getting into jobs that are really informal. And you have mentioned very well that indeed there are also those, apart from just the unemployment case, there are also those who are not in employment, education, or training. And this is a big group of the youth as well. We're talking about 20.7% of the youth who are not working, they're not participating in education, they're not in training. In fact, in 2020, this figure was about more than more than 53 million, for the whole of Africa. That tells you that if we do not do anything towards youth employment, then we are creating a very dangerous future, a future where we'll have idle youth that can then engage in other things not good for the economy, youth that can even be used, in political dimensions that may not necessarily be very useful for our countries. Youths that will not be able to participate in the development of Africa, and therefore that we will actually miss that important dividend that we need to get from our youth. Another thing that I would like to say is that apart from all this picture that I've painted here, there's also working poverty. Those who are employed, but they're still poor. And we see a number of youth, just because they, of course, they're in these informal economies, they will work, they will go to work every day, but they will still be poor. And we call that the concept of working poverty. Now we see that that working poverty is higher in Africa than anywhere else in the world. And it has been increasing over time. It has not been reducing enough. Between 2000 and 2020, for example, it only reduced by 14%. But when you look at Asia and the Pacific, the working poverty fell by about 65%. So what are we saying then? We are saying that we have a time bomb if we don't do anything. And therefore, that takes me to the second part of the question, where you are saying what strategies would look like for these youth. Well, the first thing that I want to say is that to understand youth employment or issues that actually affect the youth, we must understand the idea that employment challenges are correlated with the qualitative and quantitative aspects of each country. What do I mean? What I mean here is that the macroeconomic policy, the industrial policies we're talking about here, the microeconomic policies we're talking about here, policies that have to deal with the small, medium enterprises, all those need to embody the idea of productive labor, the idea that the youth should be part of that. The core macroeconomic policies should mainstream the idea that there is youth employment, so that we have this holistic approach to ensure that we absorb our youth. We have seen countries where deliberate efforts have been made to promote youth employment, encouraging industries to really employ the youth who may not necessarily have enough experience because of their situation. But then once you employ them, there have been some tax rebates that these industries have been getting, just to ensure that the youth are able to get employment. The other thing that I want to mention is that we must look at the specificities that abound as far as the youth are concerned. They are transitioning from school to work. If they're transitioning from school to work, why should we ask for 10 years experience if we're looking for youth employment? They are transitioning into a new place where they want to gain the skills. Why should we ask and peg the skill set that needs greater experience before we can actually get there? Why don't we prepare them in such a way that they gain these processes, in the long term? That it is a process of gaining the skills and using those skills to develop these countries. Now, policies that then support self-employment, policies that then support entrepreneurial development, policies that then support that the youth are better skilled to be able to answer to the needs of the economy are more important to us. They are more important to this continent than anywhere else. This is a very young continent. But I also want to say this, that developing or inculcating or ensuring that we incorporate the youth in the discourse of development means that we should deliberately introduce partnerships that work. And that is why at ILO, we work with all these entities, whether it's the African Union, whether it's the UNECA, whether it's African Development Bank, countries should be able to engage into meaningful partnerships that have the, at the heart, at the core, the benefits, of the youth. And we have important at the ILO programs that actually promote that. One of them that I want to mention here is the ILO ITU AU joint program on the digital economy, because we know that digitization is useful, is helpful. Of course, you have got to be careful how you deal with it, because we don't want it to also, encourage inequalities. But just making sure that the youth are able to digitize and they're able to gain some important milestone in terms of, jobs. But we also want to, again, understand that, as I've already said, the youth are likely to get into an informal job because of the nature and the structure of our economies. Then we must take deliberate efforts to look at the nexus that exists between informality and social protection. And this is where we think it is very important for us that Africa should be able to protect, to provide social protection to the youth. We know, for example, that the effective rate for social protection is only 17.4 in Africa, which is lowest globally. We need to have this. And that is why we are calling for all countries to support what we call at the United Nations, and also supported, led by the ILO, what we call the Global Accelerator for Jobs and Social Protection, which aims to activate coordinated efforts to help countries create about 400 million jobs. I think that is important. We also think, as I finish, that because the youth tend to migrate a little bit more than the others, we must put deliberate policies that support youth who are migrant workers. We have seen immigration reports showing that the youth are moving much more between countries in Africa, between regions in Africa, but also not those who are going into Europe and other countries. We want to say that we must institute policies that support fair migration, that ensure that the youth are protected. So in a nutshell, Africa is a very young continent, and therefore that policies that we embark on should carry the youth with them. Because if we do not do that, then we have the danger that this may actually turn against us as we go along. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Shawa. I think something very important you highlighted is that young people are not a homogeneous group, and policy needs to reflect that, the diverse and very, very different needs of young people. I mean, I'm not sure about other countries on the continent, but I think the definition of youth is between 18 to 35. And when you think about an 18-year-old, even a 20-year-old and a 30, 35-year-old, their lives look completely different. And so policy, programs and initiatives that stimulate employment need to be reflective of that. And just on the back of what you have just said, particularly about young people and migration, there's a comment coming through here from Antonia Leter. I really hope I got that correctly. And he says that there is a major problem happening in Africa. Many of the educated and working youth look elsewhere for better lives rather than focus on building Africa. Africa is essentially losing the brains to her continent to go and develop other countries. And I think that is just such an apt way to wrap up that question on young people and the transformation of our economies as they relate to the youth. I'm going to go back now to Professor Macmillan and bring you back into the conversation. Our co-host for today, ACET, defines transformation, and I really like this definition as growth with depth. Economic growth that is paired with diversification of economies, export competitiveness, productivity growth, technological upgrading, as well as human well-being. How do you think policies related to any of these dimensions could promote structural transformation and move resources from low productivity to high productivity sectors?
That's a very tough question. But I think something I've been thinking about a lot is the need for more education and training, but also the need for better healthcare. And as an aside, in some of the work I did on industrialization, we note that it's well known that Africa only supplies 1% of its own vaccines, for example. I mean, there's huge opportunities in the health sector, but not just for sophisticated technologies. Outreach, clinics, the level of healthcare in many countries is just substandard, and that goes for education as well. And one thing I'm wondering about, and you all may know more about this than I do, but why not engage youth in, I don't know if you want to call them public works projects, or I know, or AFRICOR, like the Peace Corps in the United States, or getting young people involved in training. Seems to me like it would be themselves being trained, but also training younger people in rural areas, for example, and also getting trained in how to provide basic health care.
Hello, please leave a message after the tone.
I'm sorry about that.
Pharmacy, calling about your prescription order ready for pickup. To continue.
Yeah, so these are the two big areas where I see, and I don't know which specific policies will address those, but I think there needs to be some creativity. I saw that the African Union had a sort of youth corps program, but it doesn't seem to be very dynamic. But something like that, I think, could be transformational if it were, if it were sold properly, if youth were engaged in that. Yeah. So those are my thoughts.
And thank you for sharing that, Professor Macmillan. And I absolutely agree with you. There's evidence that meaningful youth participation, particularly in policy processes, does tend to yield much better results and transformative results for economies. So I 100% agree with you. We should absolutely, nothing for young people without young people. That's a thing that we like to say within our youth development circles. But just before we wrap up our panel discussion, I'm going to come back to you, Professor Ono, and ask, what role should international corporations like Japan's Development Corporation play to support African economies transform as well as build resilience?
Thank you very much. I think this is one of the most important topic maybe in the forthcoming TICAT conferences. So I don't think I can really dictate all those discussions, but let me share my thinking. The first, let me talk about, just follow up what the previous speakers have been discussing, that the youth employment issues based on some maybe ongoing initiative by what Japan has been doing. I think currently, JICA has been maybe actively engaged in supporting startup business for the young entrepreneurs in Africa by maybe trying to match with some of the maybe knowledge or maybe financial or initial technical or consultancy support by also Japanese young people or those maybe that people who have an interest in doing potentially business in African countries. So maybe this is one of the maybe opportunities for maybe engaging young people by using maybe the digital technology to solve some social problem. So several initiatives are going on in country specific and also African wide of that maybe pitch event, and then followed up by some coaching. So maybe this may be a possibility for what maybe that the international cooperation together with the possible financial that the private sector can work together for African maybe use for the possible that the business expansion and also productive maybe that the job in the future. Another thing, maybe Japan and also maybe other countries have been doing is that maybe scholarship supporting for the African youth to come to maybe study in those countries with maybe hope they will eventually go back to their own countries, and then together with maybe, for example, in the case of Japan, we have a Abe Initiative Fellowship, which is financing that scholarship for the African young people to come to maybe Japanese universities for master's class, and they have an opportunity for the internship in Japanese companies. And then I think positive in maybe aspect about the last few years is that based on the internship in Japanese companies, I think Japanese companies started to think about the partnership with those young people when they start thinking of the business in Africa. Because compared to maybe some maybe other countries, historically our maybe investment relations is not deep enough. But I think knowing each other and sharing knowledge together is I think best way to co-create business opportunities there. So I think various companies in Japan which received a fellowship started to think about how to work in Africa through their network. So this may be one of the another possibility how maybe international cooperation can support in youth employment in a productive creative job. Having said that, maybe let me maybe talk more broadly what maybe international cooperation, including Japan, may be able to support for African development. I think particularly maybe Japan, together with some of the maybe international organizations like ILO or UNIDOS, I think all the agencies which have a deep interest in productive activities and manufacturing industrial development. And then in the case of Japan, I think Japan is one of the few countries which provide maybe policy support in industrial development. So one is a maybe policy level, maybe advice of looking into the specific maybe sectors, potential industries, how to develop those industries together with private sectors in skill development or farm capability building or SME development, etc. And so those are maybe policy advice to industrial development. For example, I have been also working with JICA on Ethiopia for the industrial policy dialogue, where for example, how can we attract FDI, for example, in industrial zone, how can we link up with the domestic industries, and how can we start thinking about maybe automotive industry attraction, etc. What are the maybe specific constraints in industrial park management, etc. So that we discuss maybe those concrete maybe maybe issues with maybe political leadership and the policy authorities. But this requires political commitment, as I said, in thinking about the real sector and industrial development. So before those countries which are very much interested in those industrial policy or development, I think Japan is happy to work on those policy issues. The other is maybe working more the capability of the government in supporting SME or farm capability building. For example, the Japan support like a kaizen, that is a Japanese maybe method of improving productivity and quality at the factory level through bottom-up approach, and for example, improving at the kind of the layout or production processes and the procedures, etc. And this has been really maybe initiated in Tunisia, Ethiopia, and spreading many countries in Africa through the collaboration with African Union, AUDA-NEPAD, the African Kaizen Initiative. This is also the methodology to maybe stimulate private sector farm capabilities, and also maybe changing up maybe mindset of the people, because this is a participatory process, and you really initiate your idea how to improve those kind of specific process of production. So workers can maybe feel that maybe that maybe that a sense of ownership in the production process. So the other is maybe other elements of that supporting SME development. I think Margaret talked about that the importance of various ways to linkage with the FDI and also supporting SME. And one of the way to identify the promising SME for that produce the quality product for the export, and we can also support those that the companies' capacities by so that they can maybe produce the champion products, which is maybe have a high value that the brand product overseas. So maybe those SME support can another maybe aspect. So I think maybe including Japan, there are maybe diversified maybe menu of industrial development cooperation, and also the Tibet is a very important. I think Germany has a lot of maybe deep expertise of training and vocational education based on their historical that experiences. Japan also have that Tibet the experiences, and so those maybe industrial human resource development can be very useful. But you cannot do everything from the beginning. So how can we maybe start from that certain maybe pilot initiative and then scaling up? That is very important. But to that, the objective, I think a commitment of that the country is very much needed. I just also wanted to follow up that how can we maybe make linkage maybe that's successful. I think Margaret talked about the Ethiopian case in apparel industries. We looked at several maybe Asian countries like Sri Lanka and Vietnam and Bangladesh, and then compared with Ethiopia. And I think Sri Lanka and Bangladesh particularly, and also Vietnam to some extent, I think most of the apparel exporting companies are already domestic companies. And I think they have initially attracted FDI, but through learning or technology transfers and a lot of effort, they started to develop domestic capabilities. So now I think they are the major exporters of the apparel sectors. And yet in Ethiopia, it is the FDI and a major, I think, at the producers. But how can we make sure technology transfer can be made to the domestic industry, including SME, for that, including the production, sewing, but also maybe parts and components like accessory, etc. That is a very important thing. And how can we make technology transfer possible is a very important agenda. And then I think it's very important to think about very concretely based on country-specific opportunities, like FDI attraction in apparel sector, then how can we link up with domestic industry? I think in that way, we should really develop those particular action in developing potential industries. So these are things which I hope international cooperation can do. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Ono. I think just to build from what you have said, or to add on to it, there's a comment as well, I think touching on the point about skills development, particularly for young people between Japan and Africa. And Antoinette Sala says, there is a need for more programs and internships, apprenticeships. There's a lack of experience, which is a huge bottleneck for investment in all sectors. And now to move on to my final question to Dr. Shawa, and I'm going to be unfair again, but this is the stuff moderators do, and give you just 2 to 3 minutes to answer this final question, because we are running out of time, and we do have quite a bit of engagement for our Q&A session. And I think, it takes us from one demographic that's very critical to Africa's development to another. We've been speaking about young people, and now I'd like to ask you about women. The participation of women in the labor market is critical for household economic well-being, as well as gender equity on the continent. However, women tend to be more active in informal economic activities where they face harsh working conditions, as well as low earnings. What factors lie behind this reality, and what can we do to change it?
Thank you very much, Dimpo. I will first start by giving you the statistics. When you look at Africa as a whole, 83% of workers actually work in the informal economy. 80% are male, almost 87% are women. When we take this to sub-Saharan Africa, 85% in total are in the informal employment. There are 82% of males, and there are almost 88% of females. More women find themselves in informal jobs, just like we talked about that vulnerable group called the youth. Indeed, you ask, what factors lie behind this? So one thing is already about the structure of our economies. Our economies are such that we have tended to be more into the informal sector than the formal sector. But I must say that it is also a result of our culture. The cultures in Africa have tended to, push the women in jobs that are in the care economy, for example. Think about domestic workers. So these jobs that women do are basically in the informal economy. Now, there's no way Africa will develop without the participation of youth. There's no way Africa will develop without the participation of women. And it's not just about the household economic well-being. It's about economic growth. It's about structural transformation. It's about making sure that our industrial policies are a reality. It is about ensuring that we are able to export more. It's about ensuring that we are able to contribute positively to the economy. We cannot do it without the support of female workers. We cannot do it without women. Now, governments have a lot to do. So the first thing that we need to do, governments need to be encouraged to ensure that they're investing in a future that works for women. They're investing in a future that takes into account the role, and an important role for that matter, that women play in our economies. Governments must encourage what we call equal pay for work of equal value. There can be no justification that male counterparts should be paid more than women for the same work or for equal value of work. We must ensure that we have equal pay for work of equal value. But I think something that is also very important is an idea that we must, and governments have to really be on the forefront of this, eliminate violence and harassment. And this is why the ILO adopted, the Convention C-190, which is about violence and harassment convention, ensuring that women should be protected from gender-based violence and harassment, even harassment at work. We want to make sure that governments support a work-life balance for both women and men. In other words, we do not expect the women to really engage in the care economy and still balance it up with the other parts of the economy, and the men have their own. We don't want to do that. We must have a harmonious work-life balance for both women and men. But I think what is also very important, and this is really crucial, is the idea of representation at management level. Governments must make deliberate actions to ensure that women are well represented at the table of decision making, at the table of management. when we have women at those levels, then we are likely to have policies that will be favorable to support women in the economic development nexus. So we must, government must invest to ensure that women are protected, to ensure that the sectors in which women work are decent enough, to make sure that the SDG 8, which demands that decent work should be integrated there, make sure that is inclusive enough for the vulnerable groups, for women and the youth. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shawa. I am tempted to skip the final question and go straight to a Q&A in the interest of time, but I think it's a very important question, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it anyway. But I am going to ask our panelists to please keep their responses to 2 minutes. I do not like interrupting people. It is every moderator's worst nightmare, but unfortunately, if I have to, I am going to interrupt you once you pass the 2-minute mark. And it's really a question that really, I think, sums up our conversation really well. And it's about the recent global shocks that we've experienced, such as the global financial crisis of 2008, the end of the commodity super cycle in 2015, as well as the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, which have highlighted the deep-seated structural weaknesses that have characterized Africa's development since independence, which have been reflected in surges of growth, followed by sharp decelerations and even contractions. As we wrap up, please share the 3 policy priorities that you think are necessary to drive transformation and build resilience for African economies. We can start with Professor Macmillan and then go to Professor Ono, and then we'll wrap up with you, Dr. Shawa.
Oh boy, I think African governments need to think about how they can rely less on foreign assistance and do more for themselves. We've seen, except in the case of climate change, because the rich countries owe the African countries big time. So if there's one thing that I think the African Continental Free Trade Area could do in a relatively short period of time, is bring African leaders together as a unified voice so that they have more bargaining power when it comes to climate change issues. And then I think African countries need to build up their healthcare capabilities. The pharmaceuticals industry definitely needs to be built up, and then I think more intra-African trade needs to become a higher priority. Tanzania is an incredibly amazing success story in that regard. It exports a lot of resource-based products to its neighbors. Its export growth has been phenomenal. That hasn't been accompanied by employment growth, direct employment growth, really, but that doesn't mean it's not a good thing. And as I mentioned, there are certainly lots of indirect benefits associated with that export activity. So I guess those are the 3 things that come to mind.
Okay, so thank you for, maybe I will say the first, I think government should be really seriously interested in industrial development based on the realistic understanding of the private sector situation, and then take some concrete action to find out what are the potential of the countries. I think those maybe serious that engagement with private sector is very much important. So this is my maybe first point. And second point is that the importance of maybe investing in human skill, including digitalization, because that is a maybe way that the world is going to be. And then this also includes investing in digital infrastructure. This will, I think, facilitate also maybe industrial development of service sector through e-commerce, or maybe opportunity to think about the new types of the tech business, whatever. So I think investing that the human skill, including that the digital area is very much important. And the third, I think firm capability building, including SME development, by really through like productivity, quality development, Kaizen, and also particular maybe support to the potential companies to be able to export or link up with the domestic major companies or FDI companies. Those are, I think, key steps to make that maybe productive that development for that companies. And so this is my maybe suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you. If I can go ahead. For me, the first one is social protection for all. We have seen that when we have a crisis and people are suffering, we have seen the need for social protection. The COVID crisis has laid bare the idea that workers have not been socially protected. I believe that social protection for all will be an important policy dimension that will ensure that we survive or we are resilient to the crisis. The second one is the promotion of employment with particular emphasis on youth and women. We know, and I've said it, that Africa is a young continent. We need specific incentives to provide employment to our youth. But we also know that women have been vulnerable. They have been relegated to the informality. We must make sure that the deliberate efforts to support employment for both youth and women. The third is that we must formalize, we must take the formalization process. Let us formalize, let us transition from the informal economy to the formal economy. And the ILO serves very well there because it has a recommendation 204, which is a recommendation about encouraging economies to transition from the informal economy to the formal economy. There are many ways of doing that. I'm not discussing that now, but those are my three policies. Over to you.
Thank you very much for all of your contributions and for, I think, sticking to the time. I wasn't timing those last responses, but I think they were all within 2 minutes. So thank you so much for that. I do believe we have a bit more time to respond to some of the questions that were posed during today's session from our Q&A function. I'm going to pose the first question to, I think, Professor Macmillan. And if you could answer this one again in just 2 minutes, if possible. And the question asks, who should be driving the promotion of manufacturing and how, while being aware that every context is different and that there is no one size fits all? And then the second question, I think either Dr. Shawa or Professor Ono is free to take it. And it's about how do we connect international relations, external factors such as global value chains, international prices, trade, as well as migration.
In terms of the promotion of manufacturing, I mean, I think it has to be a sort of a joint effort between the private sector and the government. I'm not sure, I think it's really the private sector that's most important here, because there are examples of, countries where the private sector gets a lot of favors from the government and tends to be exclusionary and not excited about having other investors. And in some cases, that's not true. I don't think. But I think there needs to be a serious commitment on the part of the government not to get in the way of the private sector development. So, but there's no one policy. For example, the industrial parks, for example, or special economic zones, they've been tried all over Africa. And as far as I can tell, the most successful case was in Ethiopia. And that was a combination of, the government making space for the private sector to do what it needs, but at the same time, providing incentives to the domestic private sector. So yes, it really is country dependent, but I think primarily it needs to come from the private sector.
Dr. Shaw, do you want to have a go at our final question of the day?
Yes, please. If you could just say it again. I didn't seem to see it on the question and answer. I know you are talking about trade and something like that. Just if you could just say it again.
The question is, how do we connect international relations and external factors such as global value chains, international prices, trade, and migration?
Oh, so that's a very broad question. But I think what I want to say, the aspects of how I can answer that is that we are in a global world. So Africa is not on its own. We are we are members of a global society, if you like, which means then that we will have to interact with the external world, which means then we will have to trade within ourselves, the intra-African trade, but also we will have to trade with the external world, which we are doing very much. And for me, and also of course the global value chains, which are really important. I'm just going to give an example here of the importance of these value chains and what we saw during the COVID. It is important to rely on the trade issues between Africa and other continents or other regions. But we saw during COVID that because we were supposed to be importing masks from China, because we were supposed to be importing some essentials from China and other countries for our occupational safety and health, or for our health, it became very difficult at one point when trade came to a standstill. Until I remember for some countries like in Ghana, Tanzania, the ILO supported local industries to start producing masks, to start producing gel, to start producing little things that are so important that because of our openness, we thought we would easily just import from other countries. And here where trade was blocked and we were vulnerable. For me, as we develop, as we engage with the other regions, we should also emphasize on our local domestic development, domestic production, domestic manufacturing, so that when we have a crisis like this one, the COVID, we are able to provide our people with gel, we are able to provide our people with masks, we're able to provide our people with basics, with food, all right? So for me, that is very important. The other one that I would want to finish with is that we need to use the African Free Trade Agreement much better in the sense that we need to use it as a bigger market that would then be able to attract meaningful investments from the external world. All right, and that is a must, because if we don't do that, if we don't utilize that chance, then we will always be relegated to the periphery in trade. But that also then makes difficult our value, our gains that we can augment from the value chains, from the global value chains. So that's what I would say. These are just aspects of what I would say on that question. It is a broad and important question. Over to you.
Yeah, may I just add a few things? Yeah. Okay. Regarding a global value chain, and I think it is very important because that now there are more opportunities for the low-income countries, including African countries, to really enter into the production process. So I think we should take advantage of maybe those that entry into the global value chain process. At the same time, I think assembly or sewing or cutting, those kind of producing process is at the bottom of the global value smile cup. So unless you try to enhance your values, either producing more high kind of value products or higher stage of production, or maybe R&D or design stages, I think maybe FDI can maybe go to other countries immediately. So I think it is very important to take the advantages at the same time to make sure that the technology transfer policy should be installed and then develop domestic farm capabilities. So that is, I think, very important things. The other is, I think, as Ken and also Margaret said, that I think how can we take advantage of maybe regional integration? This is also opportunities. At the same time, maybe African free trade framework is a good opportunity, but just kind of lowering tariff or is not maybe conducive to the maybe value creation for each countries, unless each country develop its own maybe domestic industries, either agriculture based, natural resource based, manufacturing based. Maybe country may be just flooded with the import of other countries' product or external product. So I think African free trade, that the framework is very important, but it all it is all the more important to make each country to work on domestic industry development. And also in the regional wide, I think maybe corridor development would be important in connectivities and also along the corridors, thinking about how maybe production process can be installed in maybe regional development or some related maybe industry development. So I think regional integration is very important, but it's not automatically bring those benefits. So I just wanted to warn that the opportunity at the same time, the challenges we have to really duly take into consideration. Thank you.
Taking into consideration those opportunities and challenges. I think that is a very nice way to wrap up. That does bring us to the end of our discussion. We're about 5 minutes over time, and as someone who moderates webinars and discussions quite a bit, I can tell you that's not bad at all. I'd like to extend gratitude to ACET and JICA for hosting us, and I think allowing us to be part of such a rich discussion. A special thank you to our panelists, Dr. Ken Shawa from the International Labour Organization, Professor Izumi Ono from JICA, as well as Professor Margaret Macmillan from Tufts University. Thank you for sharing your insights and your knowledge with us so graciously. Also a big thank you to Dr. Roberto Tibana, the Director of Research at ACET, for that comprehensive presentation of the research on resetting policy priorities to transform economies, as well as build more resilient economies post-COVID-19. Thank you to our audience for staying with us for the full 2 hours, as well as engaging with us here on the chat function, but as well as on social media. It has been an absolute pleasure to host you all. From myself, Dimpho Lecheo, and the team behind me that made all of this possible, it's goodbye. Misale kahle.